and I still refer to Al as my army dad, because that's what he was. I was 17 years old. He tried to look after me, failed miserably sometimes, but most of the time he actually did quite a good job. So that bond is very important.
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to first-hand Cold War history accounts. Do make sure you follow us in your podcast app or join our emailing list at coldwarconversations.com. We're back with Alan Hodges, a Royal Tank Regiment Chieftain tank commander, and Mick Hadfield, who is his 17-year-old gunner. In this episode, we talk in detail about their deployment to within a kilometre of the East German border and their tasks should HR have come, as well as emergency deployment from barracks. There is no affection for their main training area at Soltau, described as the moon with a few trees, and also in a few less polite terms. However, these training periods are made better by the regular appearance of Wolfgang, a German entrepreneur and British Army legend who uncannily was able to place his snack vans wherever the British Army deployed. We also hear how the crews trained in evacuating the tank if it was hit, as well as how to evade capture and resist interrogation. It's anecdotes galore again, including a visit from a Swedish major who was unwisely given the chance to drive a chieftain tank. It's also tinged with sadness as we remember those who never came back from exercises due to accidents. But it is the continuing story of a close bond that soldiers forge that still lasts to this day. You can directly help to preserve Cold War history by becoming a financial supporter of the podcast. You'll be part of our community, you'll get a sought-after Cold War Conversations coaster as a thank you, and you'll bask in the warm glow of knowing that you're helping to preserve Cold War history. If a monthly contribution is not your cup of tea, we also welcome one-off donations via coldwarconversations.com/donate. I'm delighted to welcome back Mick and Al to our Cold War conversation. As I understand it, you knew where you were going to fight. You knew the area. You knew even down to firing positions. Is that correct?
Yeah, because with all the training, obviously a lot of the training goes on in the classroom on big boards, and you move little targets around, and you've got, the East German border laid out and the West German border up to the north towards Braunschweig and coming down, Schleswig-Holstein coming down that way, Hamburg, Hanover, and really down towards the Fulda Gap where the Americans were. So in the 70s, when we were on medium recce, we used to go out on patrols in Land Rovers and drive, obviously on our side, on right up to the border. So it was laid out in standard order procedures and everything, exactly where you would be. So in various, all across, if you like, from not just our regiment, but everybody else would have their firing positions, if you like, laid out for the recce vehicles. And I have no doubt for the MBT boys, the heavy boys, theirs would be laid out in certain areas, but theirs would be more fluid in not a certain spot, but say 100 metres to the left or right would be, because once you fired one or two rounds, you don't want to be sitting in the same place, because obviously you'd have to move around a little bit. But as I say, the MBT boys would sit in that position more, because obviously the mainstream is coming across. So you'd be trying to, you would have what we would call a target-rich environment. There would be tanks and vehicles everywhere. So, you'd be taking, literally, without being stupid, pot shots at these, trying to slow them down. The recce boys is totally different, because obviously we would have already gone out there and had our positions of where we would be monitoring, not necessarily firing on things, but bringing down fire missions and where your next position would be going back. So literally on the border, that's where you would be expected to be at H-hour when they come across, and then obviously fall back or do whatever takes place into different positions as you go in, as you're withdrawing. because the British Army never retreats, it withdraws.
Yeah, indeed. So how close were your deployment positions to the border?
Well, obviously, with you could see it. You were literally on the border. You used to do patrols on our side, and they'd obviously be in what we would call, obviously, the goon towers, looking over at you. But you were literally within a kilometre. That's, you're right up there, because our job is basically the sneaky beakies, as we call them, would be in front of us, but we would be there as a forward screen. So we would then pass the information back by radio as to what's happening, and as we're falling back, that's when, as you see in normal war scenarios and war films, you're bringing down artillery barrages on certain bridges, on certain towns, to slow them up. Obviously, once they got to the big open plains, north of Hanover and coming across that towards the Lüneburg, then that's where the big boys would hopefully be to start taking them out as they were coming across that way.
And the Hildesheim was, I later found out, was almost a centre for stay-behind troops. So under the cookhouse was all the supplies for, I think it was 21 and 23 SAS. And in one of your previous episodes, there was a chap that was one of the stay-behinds for 5 Heavy, who did his training and his selection in and around Hildesheim, which was quite amazing, because we would have been in the camp at the same time that he did that. So to hear that story tied up a few loose ends, if you will. But yeah, their mission will be to head towards the East German border and let the tanks roll over the top of them before we engage with them. But I do remember an exercise where we were on it looked like the side of a hill, a forested hill, looking out towards East Germany, and we had togs back then. And it was just an open plain. I just remember thinking to myself, if anything trundles this way, we're going to have them. It was like, it literally was like shooting ducks in a barrel. Because at the time, the West Germans had said, right, if you're going to drive on the roads, then you need to put the hazardous plates on the back of the tanks and put a flashing light on top. So we were in a scenario where we were doing a war game where you would see the flashing lights on a Challenger tank 4 miles away. And then you thought, well, in a war situation, I can see further than that as well. You'd have to take into account that if the balloon did go up, then where we were sat would have been a prime site for an artillery or an airstrike. But from a point of a gunner's position, it was an absolute dream position.
Our mobility side of it, we didn't have that far really to go, to sort of get to our positions in the tanks. We only found out, as Mick was alluding to there, sort of later on in the scenario, if the Belgians had a problem in the south, we as B Squadron would have been dispatched, if you like, from 1RTR to try and assist or fill that gap, if you like, on our southern flank, down towards Paderborn and Sennelager, to help the Belgians and just, plug that little bit of a hole. But when you consider, you've got 57 tanks that are trying to head to the east as fast as possible, we were the first break line or first heavy resistance that they were going to come up against. And our job was basically, without, obviously giving away massive details, was to slow them down as long as possible so that the people to our west, south and north can get into position and carry on what few of us would have been left, I suppose.
That came into stark contrast for me when I went to QM Techs and I saw them moving a Chieftain barrel, spare barrel around. And I said, well, have we only got one barrel? And the QM said, well, you're only going to need one barrel. So that was quite you're not going to have chance to change the barrel. Yeah.
That assumes that, there's a sort of increased threat of war and you're able to deploy before they attack. But presumably some of the scenarios you were practicing was a sudden surprise crossing of the border while you were still in barracks, potentially.
We did, but where we were stationed in Hildesheim and then to the north, Hanover, we have a motorway. The motorway was there basically, if anything that would be, if you like, our holding point to the western side of that motorway. You know, we basically took over massive aircraft hangars. So we literally had 2 squadrons worth of tanks in one hangar, which was ourselves, B Squadron and A Squadron. So, you know, there's half the regiment, if you like, in one hangar. So if that got hit, then you would have had a problem. But that would have been our scenario. I mean, you know, when you consider it and the fact that we would have had, you know, God bless what's going on in Ukraine now. You had that tension at first, and then that's how it built up. That's how our, you know, supplies would turn up with diesel. You know, they turn up with our ammunition. We've practiced loading the tanks on many a time with ammunition. I mean, you're going to allude to exercise, active edge, and all the rest of that later. You know, being woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning and going into camp and stuff, getting ready, and then saying goodbye to your family and praying like hell. It is an exercise, but that's what the training comes in. And I know it sounds silly, but that's the 2 scenarios where you've got chance to be fully loaded, picked up by the low loaders if you have the, you know, and taken to wherever you're going, or caught on the hop and having to get to that motorway with your ammunition, whatever ammunition they could supply. Because don't forget, we're not loaded with anything while we're in the camp. There's nothing there. So, you know, it doesn't take 10 minutes to load a tank. It takes quite a while to get that diesel in there and all that ammunition.
We also used to have something called bog outs, and there was a divisional bog out, which we always knew was an exercise. But there was a SACEUR bog out, a Supreme Allied Commander Europe bog out, and we never knew whether that was actually real or not. And we did a couple of those, so those were a little bit hairy, and you would race down to the armory to pick up all your weapons. Now, Al was obviously married, so he had to make his way in from married quarters, whereas I was single and I was in the block, and it was expected that the singlies would pick up, you know, all the GPMGs and all the kit and drag it to the tanks, along with all your personal kit, which had to be kept to one side, and then wait for the rest of the regiment to arrive, and then we would make it out. We had an ammunition compound that wasn't that far away from us. Actually, and that was, you know, that's the other side of the thing, is we weren't just tankies. We used to have to do sight guard for places that stored ammunition as well. So that was also part of being in the army, and everybody had to do that as well.
So with these scenarios, you didn't know whether this was the real thing or not.
No.
Well, certainly not with the SACEUR ones. You
would. Just like anything else, Ian, if you put it in the scenario of if you work in a big, massive office block and somebody wants to do a fire drill, no matter how much you try and keep it quiet, somebody will know that there's a fire drill taking place at 6 o'clock in the morning. Now, you would get the rumour that you were going to practice this active edge, or, you know, but, I mean, Mick will tell you, with my lads especially, the more experience you get, your army equipment you used to have, such as your combats or your denims or whatever it is, you would have the uniform that you would use on a daily basis, but you would also, with your spare ones, put them to one side in packs ready. So I, as a married guy, I used to leave in a locker at work all my webbing, all my, what I call bog out kit. I used to leave at work, take it home every now and then to wash it, you know, so you don't smell like a wet dog on a bad day. But it would all be there in my locker ready. So as the bug out took place, I'm 90% there. Mick and the rest of the crew, by the time I got in from Hanover, where I lived, would already have the tank started up and running, fueled, anything that needed to go. I would probably just have to go and get my personal weapon, which at the time used to be a 9mm Browning. So I used to stick it in my American holster there underneath my denims, looking like Audie Murphy, and just leg it down to the tank park and jump aboard with my map and just wait for the briefing. And then you just sit there, engines running or engines not running, the auxiliary engine running if you've got the gun kit on, and just waiting for orders. Invariably what used to happen is that, you know, you used to get sort of the call about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, so you'd all be legging it down. By 11 o'clock, if it's a false alarm, you stood down, the lads go and get the breakfast and everything, and then we just debunk and get debriefed. But there was there's been quite a few times when we've been actually what I call bogged out, and then you're going on exercise. So literally you're expected to stop, and then the low loaders come and pick you up and take you up to Soltau training. So that's why you've got to be prepared. If you think it's just going to be, well, it's only an exercise, you could get caught out a few times where they throw the compo at you, the food, and you've got your guns and you've got everything, and then they say, right, we'll tell you, missus, you'll be back in 2 weeks. Yeah, it can happen.
One of the things I was going to ask you, did you practice bailing out in case the tank was hit?
Yeah. When you're out with a new troop, some people, we were lucky. We had a place called Himmelster, which is just outside Hildesheim. So it's a training area. So what you do is you do squadron exercises and regimental exercises up in the big place like Soltau or Canada. You can go on Himmelster. And quite a lot of the troops, and I know most of the troop sergeants who are still good friends of mine, we used to take them out, especially if it's a new troop, to gel, to train, and things like that. For instance, if the tank was hit, what do you take first? Well, you're going to grab your personal weapons, and you're going to grab the machine gun off the top, the commander's machine gun, which you can use, from the hip if you have to. And then you get your personal kit off, and then, well, how are you going to get rid of the tank so it can't be used? So you practice what you would do about dropping grenades inside to blow the thing up, damage the breech so it can't be used, just that type of thing, just bailing out the tank so nobody else can fight it, basically. Things that you need to survive, you've got to, you haven't got time to mess around. If this thing's on fire or you're under fire yourself, you're not going to sit there and take your time. You've got to grab whatever you can and be off there. And we practice what we call a 2-minute rule. So literally, if you were stood at the side of the tank and you threw a smoke bomb or something at me, let's see what we can get off within 2 minutes. And it would have to be weapons, your respirator, and whatever food, kit, water you can drag off there.
I remember that being absolutely exhausting, doing it on Soltau. And I remember you calling, we've been here, let's get out. And, the adrenaline's running and you're trying to grab your weapon and all your kit. And then you're trying to make your way across Soltau in knee deep mud. And trying, as far as probably no more than 50 or 60 meters. But by the time you got there, I mean, we're all fit, but absolutely thoroughly exhausted after doing that. So it was quite something to do.
Yeah. Were you ever sort of told you only give name, rank, and serial number if you're captured or anything? Was there any advice?
Oh, yeah. That's literally it. You're right. It was name, rank, and number. And obviously you don't do it on exercise. You walk around, don't you, with your wallet and your money and your pictures of the family and everything else. But literally, if you were going out into a major training exercise, or if you were in Soltau, Battus in Canada, you literally wore your dog tags. You had your dog tags on, and you literally was, you do minor exercises out there where you do escape and evasion. And if you are captured in the past, we have had exercises we've been doing on the tanks where we've had SAS and people like that actually out trying to capture tank crews, and that's part of the exercise. And when you do escape and evasion exercises with obviously your own people, but who are trained on, interrogation, they take you right through it. They dipping your head in the water and pouring water down your neck and stripping you off, sitting there for 3 hours with nothing on, that type of thing. They go through the whole caboodle with you. Yeah.
Yeah, I did that on my Carter course, where they took us down to the American sector, and the Americans acted as the opposing force, and we had to go through all of that. And being blindfolded with your head in a water trench where a Land Rover, a Humvee had been, and then they would roll the wheel back over your head so you thought it was a Humvee, and then strip you naked and all that type of things. That wasn't much fun at all. But yeah, name, rank, and number.
I hadn't realised that you'd actually gone to the lengths of escape and evasion as well. I thought that was only aircrew. That's really interesting.
No, we all do it.
Well, I always remember, if you were taking your map with you, make sure that there were no marks on the map that were, that you could actually give your position away. It was quite something. I do remember that down in the American sector with the M1s. What was the regiment? Was the 311 Armoured Cavalry?
Yeah.
Black Horse.
3rd Squadron 11 Armoured Cavalry, wasn't it? The Black Horse.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So Tracy Norris, if you're listening into this, that's your gang.
Yeah.
Alan, I asked you earlier about having a different vehicle, and I think in '84, with Lionheart, where you ended up with some War Reserve vehicle.
Oh dear. This squadron of tanks is basically a War Reserve squadron, which was kept in Sennelager, Paderborn in Germany. Now, these, Ian, were pre-IFCS. These were the world's oldest chieftain, I think, that they literally store in this facility. And believe it or not, there was an ex-RSM captain, Jack Butel, ex-1 RTR, who was actually in charge of the facility when we practiced Lionheart. Lionheart was basically like spear point exercises of the 80, which is the American reforger, where they send people over from America in their big planes. They already have 80% of their equipment already in theatre. What we practiced was on this. This is the biggest exercise that the British Army had ever done, besides going to war, which was Exercise Lionheart in '84. And literally at the time, first tanks were in one squadron were in Cyprus, so they weren't involved. A squadron were in Bovington camp, and B squadron were in Lulworth. We provided what we call War Reserve crew. We literally had to get our gear, go from Bovington to Windsor to do all the paperwork and everything. We went through the back gates of Heathrow onto a 747, British Airways, took us over to Gutterslow, got all our kit, lobbed it onto the middle of the runway and said, find your own gear. Then we had to go and get in the rail cars that you see in all these old war films, sit in them. They took us to Sennelager on those, and literally we had to sleep and live for a couple of days in the hangars of the Queen Nolan Tsars and use all their training equipment, their GTS gunnery training system and everything else. And then we were picked up on these old beasts on low loaders and taken to various locations where the different regiments were. Now, that's the only time ever that I've done an exercise where the crew are actually inside the tank, all the crew, buttoned up on the motorways as though you were fully loaded and going to war. And then different regiments would come and pick you up. So if you had, say, a squadron of the Scots DGs had lost a tank, we would then fill that gap. So literally that was our job. So we stayed out there for a couple of days, and then due to track mileage and everything else, we stayed on exercise with them, and then they were withdrawn back into the barracks, clean the tanks up, and then put them back into War Reserve. But yeah, that was a massive, massive eye-opener. So it was literally from the UK, all the reserves piling across on the ferries, and it was, the biggest exercise that the British Army have done besides the Second World War.
There's quite a lot of, I think, videos on YouTube showing excerpts from Lionheart. I want to just go in a little bit more deeper around the training, because you've mentioned Soltau. I understand from Mick was not the most hospitable place to be doing.
Well,
go on, Mick.
Yeah, how to describe Soltau? Now, I know most of the listeners are ex-veterans and things, but it was once described to me by somebody who's not a million miles away as if the world had an arsehole, Soltau was it. It was like the moon with a few trees, where you were. You can edit that bit out if you like, but it was a training area in northern Germany, which was used by the German army actually, and there was actually a bunker in there where Hitler used to direct some of his operations from, which weren't allowed to go around. But interestingly, it was next to Heide Park, which was like Blackpool Pleasure Beach next door. So you would, there's one part where you'd be driving down the side. You'd been on 2 weeks on exercise. You'd not been eating or drinking well, and you could see people having fun on the other side. But how people navigated around Soltau was beyond me. I mean, Al did it a lot more than me, so he could navigate around it with his eyes closed. And I think Soltau is probably best known for the absolute legend that is Wolfgang. And if you haven't done an episode of Wolfgang, you need to. Yeah.
Explain who Wolfgang was, because he is a definite legend of the British Army of the Rhine.
So Wolfgang had a blue Mercedes van, a long wheelbase van, and a bit like a truck would turn up to feed people at a football match. Then he would travel around Soltau in this blue van, and he would feed people food and drink. And he knew where everybody was. There were rumours that he was working for the Soviets, which obviously he wasn't. But he could get to places that even the tanks couldn't get to. He was a legend. So, and when you've been on exercise for 2 weeks and you've been eating nothing but compo rations and screech, drinking screech and whatnot, you would see Wolfgang coming around the corner. The exercise stopped, and everybody would line up and get their bratties from Wolfgang, that is a legend. And there was a couple of times where I wasn't on Al's tanks and I was commanding the 432, the bonk. I mean, it was called a bonk because you used to bonk your head around all the time on the inside of it. And I got lost, and he was there, and he would I would say, where's B Squadron? And he would tell you exactly where you were, even though we were all tactical. So this guy is an absolute legend that most people that have served in Germany would have heard of, and I'm sure Alan's got plenty of stories as well.
Yeah, I mean, he ended up with, I think, about 3 or 4 vans. So whenever you came out of Rheinzelen camp, which was the main base, where it's on Lüneburg Heath, just to the north of Hanover, that way, Celle, and north of Hohne Ranges that we used to go firing on. And the guy was unbelievable. You come out of Rheinzelen camp and you go over what we call the tank bridge, which would take you over the main road into this godforsaken land of mosquitoes, mud, a thing called, your listeners have probably heard of the word stripwood. There was hardly any trees left, but any exercise that took place, Wolfgang would be there. Wolfgang could tell you exactly what you were going to do the next day. And it was incredible that the guy, the minute the battle stopped, he would be sat there waiting to feed everybody. So you'd have a squadron of tanks and, a battery of artillery and a squadron of infantry legging it over to this wood, big battle taking place like boy soldiers. And the minute somebody shouted end X and it was over, these vans would appear out of nowhere with bratwurst, frikadella, pommies, beer, you name it. This guy would be sitting there making an absolute fortune. But Soltau itself as a training area really is invaluable because it's basically what you normally use, or what we normally use pre going to Canada. So all the big exercises took place out in, obviously, on normal roads and in normal, but your pre-Soltau batters training always took on Soltau and Hohne for firing.
I mean, both of you sent me a few little anecdotes, which I've enjoyed. One of the ones I did want to ask you, Mick, about was the Swedish S-tank major.
The Swedish major had obviously served on S-tanks, and he was coming down to either evaluate or to have a look at the chieftains. Now, bearing in mind that, he spent all this time on a tank that didn't have a turret, we let him loose in the driver's seat of a chieftain. And my recollection is of him driving full speed over the humps and bumps and battering everybody around in the turret, not realising that we actually had a turret. And I came out of that one pretty battered and bruised. But I do remember we had something called a smoker, which is basically a barbecue. So we would knock a couple of trees down, pour some oil over it, set fire to it, and have some food. And at the time, I had a 2-litre bottle of Coke, which had Southern Comfort in it. And for some reason, I thought I'd be able to drink out this major. I lost big time, and I've never drunk Southern Comfort since.
One thing I did want to talk about, and I've mentioned this in other episodes, is I think a very much forgotten or understudied part of the Cold War are the casualties that happened on these exercises. Well, not just in exercises, but just in training generally. I think, Mick, you were telling me about a particular incident. I wonder whether you can describe that for me.
Yeah, sure. It was very sad. It was we were on the ring road at Horner Ranges, waiting to go to another firing point, and we were stopped. And I didn't know why we were stopped, but then it came over the radio that a tank from another regiment had overturned and got into a river, and they'd managed to get. I think they managed to get the loader out and the commander out. I don't remember whether they got the driver out. Unfortunately, the poor lad that was the gunner was in the tank that was filling up with water, and I believe they were talking to the guy through the telephone, which is on the outside at the back of the tank. And unfortunately, they couldn't save him. And I just remember it being a very early time in my life where I really did think about how lucky I was to be alive and how dangerous this job actually is, and just feeling mortal, for want of a better word. It was quite a sad incident.
We talk about, sort of funny incidents and things like that, but this was serious stuff, not purely because of the perceived threat from the Soviets, but every time you took one of these vehicles out, they were big beasts. You were dealing with machinery and equipment that handled incorrectly could be fatal. I dread to think how many people the Soviets must have lost on exercise, because they were, from my viewpoint, not exactly hugely focused on safety.
Well, there was also the time, and this was before my time, but where the crew had slept underneath one of the tanks, and then the tank had sunk down, and there's nothing they could do for those guys. But there were some near misses as well. I would consider our experience on ranges where the fume extractor failed as a close miss. If we'd stayed in that turret for 5 or 10 minutes more, it could have been a whole different story.
I think when people forget, Ian, to be honest, these things are like 60 tons, and they do move at a fair speed. Obviously not like Challenger 1 or Challenger 2, but they can knock down trees and everything. I think my biggest experience that I had was twofold really. When we're on exercise, if you don't have to, or instructed that you get your tank bivvy out, my guys, and to be honest, I would think now 94% of the crews used to sleep on the back decks. Simple as, when tanks are moving around that wood at night, you haven't a clue where they're coming from and where they're going to. It's pitch black. So all we used to do was elevate the barrel slightly, put the tank sheet over the top of the barrel and make like a tent. Mm. And we used to just sleep on the back decks of the tank. A, it was safer than being on the floor, but B, if you've been running most of the day, it was warm anyway. We did have on one of the Soltau exercises, I think it was a young lad from the Welsh Guards, one of our tanks actually went over the top of his trench, and unfortunately he suffocated or he was crushed because obviously it just caved in on an exercise at night when you're attacking with tanks and infantry, you've got little pin lights to show you where these things are, and apparently one of ours went over the top. So unfortunately this young lad lost his life. In Canada, there's been numerous, on a Liga where you're supposed to come in from the back that's open. Tanks have come in from the side and ran over ammunition and, helicopter crashes and everything else. So you're playing the game, but you're playing the game for real. And it's not like when you're young kids playing soldier, you've got a lot of hardware on the move at a lot of times. So unfortunately, accidents do take place. We accepted it and we just did the best we could, older people like myself, to protect the younger ones. And it all come with experience. It all just came with experience.
Sobering stuff there. Is there anything else that we can go? I'm conscious that we've been talking for like almost 2 hours now.
I'm enjoying it.
Good. That's what I like to hear.
This is just the intro.
Yeah, this is just the intro bit. Got another 7 years, yeah?
I might have to release a director's cut at this rate.
Okay, yeah. So we were on. I can't remember where the exercise was, but I at the time I'd moved on from Al's tank, and I was the gunner for OCB Squadron, Major VZ Holt. But I was running the armoured ambulance 1-4 Bravo, affectionately known as the Bonk, and it was my job to deliver at the time radios and supply, whatever people needed. So I would be the squadron's taxi. Being driven by a chap called Willis, Mad Dog Willis. I'm pretty sure every regiment had a Mad Dog in there somewhere. So yeah, I was tasked to bring some radios to a tank and got utterly lost. Unbeknownst to me, I drove down a road towards an enemy formation that was lining up for battle, and I remember seeing a recce troop on my right hand side, which happened to be our recce troop. And I remember recognising it as our recce troop and waving to a guy called Rat Reed, and then listening to him report me as an enemy unit going the wrong way. And I was, no, it's not. That's not me. But unfortunately, my mind tape, which had denoted me as being blue rather than red for us, had got ripped off when I was travelling through the woods. And I came out into this vista in a valley, and I saw a full squadron of Challenger tanks. I saw parachute regiment soldiers and a whole series of troops moving up a line towards the recce troop, who were quite correctly doing their job. And I thought, I've got to bluff this out now. So I literally stopped by the nearest tank and asked where I was. And he pointed to the map, and the umpire came down and after I'd taken back off up the hill and said, "Where's your mind tape?" And I explained the situation, and he was like, "Yeah, okay, that's fine, get gone." And as I'm driving back up the hill, I was literally flanked by some trucks left and right. So I'm sat in the middle of a convoy, me and Mad Dog Willis, and passed Rat Reed coming the other way, and got reported the other way as well. But managed to get back to the OC's tank and told him what I'd seen. And then I parked around the edge of a wood. There's actually, I've given you a picture of me staring into the air. But at that moment, on that particular picture that I've given you, there was some Lynx attack helicopters that had been called in. I'm not so sure whether that was as the result of my dodgy information, but I do remember. Is that classed as cheating? I'm not really sure. But hey, all's fair in love and war.
Artistic license, Mick.
Well, this is it, isn't it? I felt incredibly embarrassed that A, I got lost, B, an enemy tank commander had told me which way to go, and then I promptly reported his battle group. And then in my head, I'm pretty sure that the attack helicopters, there were 7 of them, took off and headed in that direction. So I'd like to think I did my bit to end the war, or at least the exercise anyway.
Oh, brilliant.
I think we've done the training aspect of it, which was 80% really of our daily routine. I think, to be honest, a lot of people don't understand how much that training helped at the time of the 70s and the 80s. And obviously with the wall coming down in the 90s, early 90, that, you see these guys now, bless them, that are on Challenger 2 and everything else, and the things they've gone through in Afghanistan and Iraq and all that sort of thing. They've got a chest full of ribbons, bless them. And now, we were lucky, I suppose, if we had 3, which would be Northern Ireland, the General Service Medal, Cyprus with the UN, and what I would call your long service, never been caught medal, your LS and GC. But that was our time, I think. That's, if you consider that most of the people went in as young kids at 16, 17, 18, and you come out now mid-30s, I think, somewhere around there. I'm still friends and Mick's probably the same, with people I joined up in 75, 76, with Facebook, internet, your good selves doing all this. We're still in contact. And And it really is, like the Americans say, a band of brothers. And with Mick, I'm still in contact with Mick now. As a tank crew, it was Al, Mick, Steve, Dave. You got call sergeant, staff sergeant, sir, or whatever. When you're off there, you literally sat in each other's pockets. And at the end of the day, if Cold War proved one thing for all of us, is that you were literally a brother from another mother. Simple as. These young kids, I always said, as troop sergeant or troop leader, which I end up in on Chieftain anyway, there's 11 other people that I had to make sure was okay. I had my own family in Hanover, but as long as these, my job was to keep these 11 people safe. Thankfully, hindsight's a brilliant thing, Ian. We never went to war. But you nearly had the Cuban crisis. We've now got this thing taking place in Ukraine. How quickly has that come about? So how quickly could things have deteriorated in such a place in the 70s and 80s while we're in Europe, whether it be over oil, grain or whatever, that the Soviet Pact, as it was then, decided they needed to head west to survive. And then we'd have had World War III on our hands.
I want to reinforce that point, particularly around how close we were, how cohesive we were as a unit, and that bond still lasts to this day. And trying to explain to people how close that bond is, it's like having a brother, but it's in some respects it's deeper than that. And in one of your previous podcasts, there was one of your chaps that said, if the balloon had gone up, then lots of people would be heading down the autobahn, heading towards the ports. I've got to completely disagree with that. Particularly, I can just speak for one RTR. We were up for the fight. We weren't going that way. We were heading towards Berlin. If you've ever seen the movie, what's the movie with Brad Pitt in?
Fury.
So a lot of us still say best job I ever had, because that's what they say in there. And we were the glue that held everything together. And there are legends in every regiment, including ours. And I'm sure that the bond that we had, which still lasts today, continues through in all regiments, but particularly in Royal Tank Regiment. And we still feel very, very close to the Royal Tank, even though there's been an amalgamation from 1, 2, 3, 4 down to 1, 2, down to the Royal Tank Regiment. It's still my regiment, and it still will be until the day I die. And the people that were in it, whether you're in for 3 years or 33 years, it's something that is something that's central to the way I grew up. And I still refer to Al as my army dad, because that's what he was. I was 17 years old. He tried to look after me, failed miserably sometimes, but most of the time he actually did quite a good job. So that bond is very important.
Sounds like you went off the rails when you left him, what with Southern Comfort and Swedish Majors,
To be honest, Ian, there is so many stories that we could tell. I mean, like on the tank ranges, people go, you're training. People go, oh, well, it must have been great. Yeah, but you're training for war. So we've done the training. This was our time to prove we could do what we've done in training. And there was all sorts of trophies and everything else you could go for. I mean, Mick can tell you about they had an exercise called Oscar, where you get basically 10 rounds per tank. There's 30 rounds for the 3 tanks. And it was unheard of that anybody had got maximum. We literally, the troop leader, Taff, is a radio man. But we trained up that Wales that he actually hit 10 out of 10. We came off, and I was adamant we'd had 9 out of 10, but the story was that as this moving target was pulling behind the mound, Mick said, shall I go for it? And I went, let it go. All the firing now and everything went out the window. I said, let it go. He banged at it, and it literally hit it just over the top of the mound. And we argued like mad with the guy in charge to say, we hit it. There's nothing saying that, he was hiding behind the house. We hit it. So we got 10. And it made you feel good. It made you feel good that all that training as a crew, not just the commander and the gunner, all 4 of us, all 12 of us as a troop, all 80 of us as a squadron, all 300 of us as a regiment. That's what we train for. And thankfully, we're still here to talk about it.
I mean, you're training for this stuff every day. How do you retain that focus and concentrate? You know, what makes you continue to strive and do that?
I think, to be honest, like any other job, take a break from it. It wasn't so intense that you were there at 8:30 in the morning. You know, let's say 80% of our time during the week would be on tank maintenance. It would be, you know, track bashing, cleaning the guns, like your, you know, servicing, classroom work. But it literally was exactly as it said on the tin. We trained hard and played hard sport, doing other things, visiting Berlin, for instance, which was on the eastern side. We could go on the military train or drive up the motorway and visit Berlin. And we could even go into East Berlin in uniform. So we saw both sides. We could go to the border. You'd send people out down to the American sector at Fulda Gap to see what their problem was. We got very, very friendly, as Mick alluded to an American regiment called 3rd Squadron 11 Armoured Cavalry, we used to do exchange work on their M1 tank, their Abrams. And they were brilliant people. So it was literally not just the training side of it, but also the social side was very important as well for bonding, I think.
I do remember going down to Bad Hersfeld and meeting the 311 ACR. They had M1A1 and Abrams, and they took us into their tank simulators, which were a damn sight better than ours. They were all computerized. And they were, I mean, they'd given us very, very minimal training on how to gun their tanks, and it was just a bit of a plaything. And they had different levels of level 1 to 10 or whatever. And I think first time round, me and Al got up to level 6, which was sort of unheard of. You know, we were shooting at hinds that were on the screen and things like that. But, you know, in the evenings, the Americans would hold a barbecue, or they'd take us down into Bad Hersfeld for a few drinks and things like that. So there was quite they were our sister regiment, basically. And, you know, some of those, and I know, Al, you know, I've got a friend in America called Tracy Norris, and you've got friends that still exist to this day from that regiment.
As you say, Alan, a true band of brothers.
I think if anybody really wants to know what it was like, I would say that book by Tom Clancy of Red Storm Rising was very, very good, and where it was as close as Chieftain for us as a regiment, even though it was, you know, a cavalry unit, or as I call donkey wallopers. You know, it was really good. But if you read Red Storm Rising, then it's as close as you would have got to that World War III, not just on the eastern side of the tanks and firepower and everything else, but as a war, you know, where they invade Iceland and all the rest of the stuff. So when you read things like that, that's the scenario that we didn't just train on what was happening in our theatre. We literally learned the whole ball, you know, the whole picture. It's quite easy just to concentrate on our one little patch. But, you know, imagine we held our patch and something happened in the Fulda Gap. You know, you would then have to swing south and plug gaps and everything else. But you would be literally fighting a rearguard action, wouldn't we? We'd be pulling back and surviving as best we could with what ammunition and fuel we got, I suppose.
The two other books that are worthy of mention is I think my favourite is called Chieftains by Rob Forrest Brown, I think it is, and that's the story of, you know, the chieftain tank crew in World War III. But another one which is probably not as well known, it's called Red Army by Ralph Peters, and that tells you the story of you know, the Cold War going hot, but from both sides.
It's probably because I'm so immersed in this stuff. I'm amazed that nobody's made a film about Cold War going hot, because what with all the CGI that they have now.
I think that's it, Ian. I think with CGI now, they could probably do that, couldn't they? I do know that if you go on YouTube, I think somebody's actually putting a few bits and pieces together with Red Storm Rising. I'm pretty sure somebody said there's one or two CGI type things going on there, but it as people who were there, it would be fascinating to see that sort of film made, I think.
Have you ever tried out any of these computer games that try and reproduce the Cold War?
Well, I'm a little bit younger than Al, so I'm into computer games and things. I think the issue with doing that is, and I'm sure all the wives can attest to this, and all the squaddies around the world will attest to this, is the moment something comes on TV and somebody calls a BMP a tank, well, that's it. That's the movie ruined. So I think all squaddies will be looking at a movie or a video game and picking out the inaccuracies, that it's not an M1A1, it's an M1A2. And that's a really good fire position from behind that wood. So we're not really best placed to give a critical acclaim of a computer game, because we probably rip them to shreds for their inaccuracies. There are a couple. I mean, World of Tanks is out there, but it doesn't mimic it.
They're there for entertainment, whereas it's very difficult to reproduce the waiting around and the fixing of the tracks and the cleaning out of the inside and the reality of it. It's and I think that's what people don't realise about being in the military. Well, I guess they do. I mean, there's that famous comment. What is it? It's sort of like 90% boredom and 10% absolute terror or something.
I'll tell you what my favourite saying used to be, Ian. Okay, so the OC would come up to the Sergeant Major and say, "Sergeant Major, yes, sir. Fuck the men about. Right, sir. Get on the truck, get off the truck. Get on the truck, get off the truck. Men fucked about. Thank you, Sergeant Major." That's what it was like sometimes.
Al, do you remember that every Friday we used to sweep the tank park, regardless of whether it was clean or not? And once a year we had a regimental leaf clearing day until somebody worked out the man cost of it all.
Ian, he's probably had people on there on his pod that have said exactly the same with royal visits. I'm sure the Queen, bless her soul, when she used to come visiting, thought that every blade of grass was bright green and every stone was white.
It was painted green.
But that's, unfortunately, that's, as I say, that was part of it. It was sometimes the boredom side of it. But again, that's why I said with the social side, it wasn't just drinking and blah, blah. We were, some people were in Germany because that's where the work was. Families were the same. A lot of families didn't like to be out there, but that's where the husbands were. And I suppose, Ian, if you said, what benefit did we get from that? We were in the middle of Europe. You could travel, was fantastic. You could travel anywhere you wanted. Alcohol was cheap. Cigarettes were cheap. Fuel, we had coupons, so you got cheap fuel. Imagine you had cheap fuel coupons now, you'd be all over the world. But that's exactly, so to me personally, and my young family, what I did is immerse myself in it. And that was the main thing. If you're in Germany or wherever you may be, make the best of a bad deal. And, I played football for a local German team, and my daughter and wife played netball and found a job in Germany. So, it was a stressful job and there's no getting away from that. But we had a good time. It was a good time to be in and around Europe. It really was.
Well, many people say that Germany was a great posting.
Yeah, I think, particularly Hildesheim as well was a great posting. And again, listening to some of your podcasts where the Russians really didn't integrate. They stayed in barracks, etc. And you could go wherever we want. We were encouraged to do whatever we want. So I'll be out clubbing in Hildesheim and Hanover at the weekends. I'd also was also a member of a local shooting club as well. So there was plenty of things to do in camp as well. I mean, we haven't even got onto the whole subject of camaraderie. That's probably another episode. A great celebration of tanks in action. But every regiment has its own regimental day. But there's always something going on. There was something on in the gym. There were football matches. So we were okay. So I don't ever remember being bored, to be fair.
Don't miss the episode extras such as videos, photos and other content. Just look for the link in the podcast information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous support of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. If you'd like to help the project, just go to coldwarconversations.com/donate. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and see you next week.